Welcome to the Performing Arts series brought to you by the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and the Prince William Network. I'm Eden Ross Lipson, your moderator for today's program with two outstanding children's authors, Lensey Namioka and Andrea Davis Pinkney. Thank you both for being with us today. Lensey and Andrea represent Asian and African American cultures. Lensey Namioka writes stories based on both the Chinese and Japanese history. Andrea Davis Pinkney writes stories based on the African American experience. Have you ever wondered what compels people to write, to tell stories? Why do we like to read their stories? Do Lensey Namioka and Andrea Davis Pinkney write only for Chinese or African American readers? Today we're going to be talking to two award-winning novelists who will tell us why they became writers and why they write the kinds of stories they do. And we're going to start with Andrea, because you began as a magazine journalist, and your first children's books weren't stories but biographies, picture book biographies. Tell us how it happened.
That's right, Eden. I was a magazine editor, and one of the things I did was interview a lot of different people. And during that process, I interviewed Alvin Ailey, the dancer and choreographer.
That's where it comes
And I thought, that would make a great children's book. A lot of people need to know about him. And when I was a youngster, my parents would take me every year to City Center to see the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. And that's how the idea came, and it became a children's book.
Now, you did those books with your husband, who is a distinguished artist from a family of distinguished artists, and he has a distinctive style. How did you put the Ailey book together, just to use that as the starter?
Right. My husband is Brian Pinkney, the illustrator, and we were thinking, what kind of book would we like to collaborate on? And similarly, since I had gone to City Center as a child, we started to go together and see Alvin Ailey. And one day I just said to him, I wish there was something that we both were really interested in and that we both felt passionate about. I said, I don't know, like Alvin Ailey. And we got the idea, and one thing led to another,
and
we created
the other subjects, as you went from person to person, how did they evolve?
Brian and I have collaborated on 8 books together, many of them biographies, and it evolved in a similar way. We would think, who do we both really feel passionate about? In the case of Duke Ellington, it was another thing where kind of the light bulb went on, so to speak. Rodeo riding cowboy, Bill Pickett. We were in Denver at the Black Cowboy Museum, and we saw an exhibit on Bill Pickett, and there again, the idea just kind of popped into our thinking.
But when you work with an illustrator and you figure out the text of a biography, you're answering questions people don't know they want to know. How do you pare down a life in the way that's necessary for a storybook?
Well, that's a great question, because a picture book is only 32 pages, and a lifetime can span many, many years, as we all know. Dear Benjamin Banneker is one of our picture books, one of the ones that Brian and I collaborated on together, about Benjamin Banneker, who was...
Wait, does everybody know who Benjamin Banneker was? Andrea will tell you real quick.
Okay, sure. An astronomer, and he actually laid the plans for the city of Washington, D.C. He did a lot of things. And how do you condense that into a 32-page picture book? We usually like to pick one very pivotal thing about the person and focus on that. I always try to also focus on what the person was like as a child, and start there and work my way up.
Starting as a child, what led you then to go on and write fiction yourself?
Well, I always was a big reader. My mom was an English teacher when I was growing up. My dad was and still is a master storyteller. We have a little kind of unspoken rule in our home: when you are at a holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas and you're sitting around the table, you have to be prepared to tell a good story. And I think having a mom who was always pushing books on me and a dad who was telling stories kind of came together, and I thought, I'd like to write the books that I hear about and the stories.
Is it easy?
Oh, no, it's not easy. And I have a little joke. A lot of people that I know from my magazine work always kind of come to me and say they'd like to write a picture book because it's short.
Right.
Because
they
it's
all
easy.
say that, right.
And I find it's the hardest writing that there is.
There's a phrase that's used by Carla Cuskin, who wrote many of the books you read and read when you were younger. She says that when a picture book works, it's like opera, and the music and the illustrations are inseparable. The music and the words, the music and the dance. And it's true. Storybooks are very hard to tell, and yet if you're grounded in that, you can turn to fiction, and you have, and yet you've chosen subjects, historical and contemporary.
Right.
How?
Well, I'm a history buff, so that's where the historical aspect comes from. And then because my training is in journalism, I'm always interested in the kind of issues of the day. My novel, Raven in a Dove House, tells the story of a 12-year-old girl, Nell, who is asked by her cousin and his best friend to hide their gun. When I wrote the book, there was a lot in the press about young people and violence, and I thought this is an issue that really needs to be addressed, and one that is certainly valid and that young people should know about. Another one of my novels, Hold Fast to Dreams, is based partly on some of my own experience growing up in a small town in Connecticut where my family was one of the few black families. And that book started as an essay for the New York Times. My editor said to me, I think there's a bigger story here, and maybe you'd like to turn it into a novel, and I did.
Bigger stories. I'm going to turn briefly to Lensey. Lensey came to the United States at the age of 9, not speaking English at all, and had a professional career as a mathematician and math teacher before she ever started writing children's books. And I thought, because Thanksgiving is coming, that I would ask Lensey to read the beginning of one of her lighthearted books about the immigrant experience, and that's not a contradiction in terms. But can we begin by asking Lensey Namioka to read from Yang the Third and the Impossible Family the week before Thanksgiving?
Okay. The Connors are inviting us for Thanksgiving dinner, yelled fourth brother. The Connors are our neighbors here in Seattle, and Matthew Connor is fourth brother's best friend. We were all happy about the invitation. For weeks, we've been hearing about the American holiday called Thanksgiving. Since coming to this country, we've tried our best to do everything properly. But when Mother heard that preparing a Thanksgiving dinner involved roasting a turkey, she was horrified. "I can't even roast a pigeon," she cried. "If I tried to wrestle with a turkey, I'd lose." Now we learn how real Americans celebrate Thanksgiving. We get a delicious meal like the ones I'd seen illustrated in all the papers and magazines. What excited me most was hearing that Holly Hansen and her mother were invited too. When I was little, we had a tin candy box, and on the lid was a picture of a princess with curly blonde hair. Holly Hansen looked just like the princess in that picture. She was in a couple of my classes in school, and she always spoke in a soft, unhurried way. I thought if the princess on the candy box spoke, she would sound just like that. At the Connors, I would finally get a chance to get acquainted with Holly. But I was nervous too, because I wanted so much to have my family make a good impression. We all tried to look our best for the Thanksgiving dinner. Father had on the dark suit he wore for playing in public. Mother wore a dress she bought at the Goodwill store for $3. The huge shoulder pads made her look like a stranger, an aggressive stranger. Mrs. Hansen and Holly arrived a few minutes after we did. I was delighted when Mrs. Connor seated me next to Holly, but the only thing I could think to say, "I've seen you in the orchestra." It sounded stupid as soon as I said it, but Holly just nodded and murmured something. The dinner began with Mr. Connor saying some words of thanks for his family's good fortune. It sounded like a toast at a Chinese banquet, and I thought he sounded very dignified. Mrs. Connor carried out the whole roast turkey into the dining room, and we all exclaimed at the size of the turkey. It was the largest bird I'd ever seen. Mr. Connor began sharpening a wicked-looking knife. Then he took up the knife and a big fork and began to cut thin slices of meat. We Yangs looked at one another in wonder. Instead of complaining about being made to do the slicing, Mr. Connor looked pleased and proud. After slicing a pile of turkey meat, Mr. Connor started to scoop from the stomach of the bird. I was horrified. Had Mrs. Connor forgotten to dress the turkey and left all the guts behind? To my astonishment and relief, what Mr. Connor scooped out was not the messy intestines. Mrs. Connor hadn't forgotten to dress the bird after all. She stuffed the stomach of the bird with a savory mixture of bread and onions. We gasped with admiration, and Mrs. Connor looked pleased. "I hope you like the stuffing. I'm trying out a new recipe." Mr. Connor placed some slices of turkey meat on a plate and then added a spoonful of the stuffing mixture. He passed the first plate to Mother. "Oh, I couldn't take this," Mother said politely. She passed the plate on to Mrs. Hanson. Mrs. Hanson was jammed up against Mother's shoulder pad. She passed the plate back to Mother. "Oh, no, it's meant for you, Mrs. Yang." Mother handed the plate back again. "You're so much older, Mrs. Hanson. You should be served first." Mrs. Hanson froze. In the silence, I could hear the sauce going drip, drip from Mr. Connor's ladle. "What makes you think so?" asked Mrs. Hanson. "Just what makes you think I'm older?" "Mom, let's skip it," Holly whispered. I had already learned that in America it isn't considered an honor to be old. Instead of respecting older people as we do, Americans think it's pitiful to be old. Would Mother say something else embarrassing? She didn't disappoint me. "Well, how old are you then?" Mother asked Mrs. Hanson. "I am 36, Mrs. Hanson replied, each syllable falling like a chunk of ice. "Oh, really?" said Mother brightly. "You look much older." Mr. Connor's face turned bright red and he seemed to be having trouble breathing. Mrs. Connor was bent over as if in pain. Somehow the dinner went on. Mrs. Hanson finally unclenched her jaw and told Mrs. Connor how delicious the cranberry sauce was. I figured she was referring to the pile of red, poisonous-looking berries. I put a berry in my mouth and almost gagged at its sour taste. Next to me, fourth brother quietly spat his cranberries into his paper napkin, wadded the napkin, and stuffed it into his pocket. I hope he wouldn't forget about it later. The rest of the food was delicious, though. I thought the stuffing tasted even better than the turkey meat. The good food seemed to relax everybody, and people began to chat. I asked Holly about herself. "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" "No, there's just Mom and me at home," she said. "My parents were divorced 3 years ago." I tried to find something sympathetic to say. "Do you spend much time with your father?" I asked. "I stay with him during the summer," said Holly. "He has a boat and takes me sailing." I was impressed. "A boat? Your father must be rich." As soon as the words left my mouth, I wish I could take them back. I'd forgotten that in America it isn't polite to discuss money. However much I tried, I just couldn't remember everything. After the dinner plates were cleared, Mrs. Connor brought in the dessert, ice cream and 3 different kinds of pies. Again, the first slice of pie went to Mother. This time she didn't try to pass it on to Mrs. Hanson. She'd learned her lesson. Mrs. Hanson looked at the piece of pie served to her. "Oh, I couldn't eat all this. I've already put on 2 pounds this month, and I can't afford to gain another ounce." "Of course you can afford it," Mrs. Connor said. "You're so skinny you can put on 10 pounds and still look terrific." Mother was staring at Mrs. Hanson and Mrs. Connor. "We Chinese think that being fat is good. It's a sign of good fortune." But I knew that here, being thin is supposed to be attractive. A lot of girls in school are worried about their weight, and some of them even go on diets. I saw Mother open her mouth. "Don't say it, Mother," I wanted to shout. "Don't say it." But she did. Radiating goodwill, Mother said, "Why, you're not skinny at all, Mrs. Hanson. You're actually quite fat."
To see ourselves as others see us is the issue. Lensey, you have your childhood memories to draw on, raising your own children. The Yang family comes out of such goodwill and such culture clash. Mm-hmm. How did the stories emerge?
Well, I didn't really try to write about my family, but it is true that the first book, Yang the Youngest and His Terrible Ear, is about this very musical family where the youngest boy has a terrible ear. So maybe that's me, because I come from a musical family and I have a terrible ear. The first time I played my violin, my cat jumped under the bed and refused to come out. So.
But you kept on?
No. My teacher got sick a lot, and then my exercise book disappeared mysteriously. So then I'm going to give up the violin, and nobody objected strongly.
Tell me about how you taught mathematics for a long time, and you have that disciplined sense of exploration in your work.
Wow.
Do you see it as you structure your stories?
Discipline, that's wonderful. No, actually, what I learned from math is thrift. Mathematicians are thrifty. mean, some people say, because they want to spend very little money to get a lot. To prove a strong theorem in math, you want to spend very little hypothesis and get a lot of conclusion. So from a very early age, mathematicians learn to be thrifty. And that's the one thing I learned about writing. I never throw anything away, but keep using it.
And you've done different kinds of books. You've done, you yourself are married to a distinguished Japanese mathematician, and you've used his history as the basis for a series of historical novels.
Yeah, my father-in-law is crazy about castles, and he got me interested in castles too.
Do you all know that there are lots of castles in Japan? Do you think of castles in Japan?
Oh, Japanese castles are fascinating because they're usually surrounded by a maze-like thing, and you can get lost in it. That's to protect the castle from attackers. The attackers will get lost in the maze, and the defenders can shoot arrows or guns down at them. So I wrote a story about a spooky Japanese castle called White Serpent Castle, and it's a castle haunted by a serpent ghost. And the moat surrounds the castle like a maze.
And then you went on with the Den of the White Fox.
Yeah, that's...
Can we explain a little bit? Again, this is great historical fiction with galloping samurai.
Right. Well, I love adventure stories. I grew up reading them, so I still enjoy writing them. And I like to write about these two dashing Japanese samurai going around the country, getting into adventures. The Den of the White Fox comes from a place I visited in Japan, a dark, rather spooky valley, rather cut off. And I asked about the history of the valley and discovered it's settled by an ancient Japanese family. 900 years ago, they were defeated in a battle, and the survivors wound up in this valley, some other valleys too. But so I got interested in their story, and that's what it's based on, this book.
We're going to switch back to Andrea, and because part of this experience is performance, we're going to ask Andrea to read to us in a minute, as she's going to move over to the podium and do it. She's going to tell us a little bit about her book about Duke Ellington and read from that. And since this is the Performing Arts program, we hope you know Duke Ellington's music, but just in case you don't.
Okay, Duke Ellington was known as the Piano Prince. He played the piano, he was a composer, but one of the things I love about Duke Ellington is that he made it up as he went along. He improvised. That means he didn't think about it beforehand, he just did it. The other thing I love about Duke Ellington is that even though he played the piano, folks said that his real instrument was his orchestra, that he blended the different instruments in his orchestra to make one instrument. And I'm going to read a section about his drummer, Sonny Greer, who drummed like the subway. And it says this: "Sometimes the orchestra performed their tunes straight up, but other nights, when the joints started to jump, Duke told his band to play whatever came to mind, to improvise their solos, to make the music fly. And they did. Each instrument raised its own voice. One by one, each cat took the floor and wiped it clean with his own special way of playing. Sonny Greer pounded out the bang of jump rope feet on the street with his snare drum, a subway beat on his bass drum, a sassy ride on his cymbal. Sonny's percussion was smooth and steady. Sometimes only his drumsticks made the music, cracking out the rattly beat of wood slapping wood." And it's interesting that I read a little bit about the subway there, because that's where I do some of my best writing, on the subway train.
And your current novel is set during the Civil War and is about a brother and a sister named Summer and Roscoe.
Right. Silent Thunder is set in 1862 on a plantation in Virginia, the plantation of a master named Gideon Parnell. It is told in alternating voices. Summer Parnell is 12. Her brother Roscoe is 13, and each one of these children have a secret wish. Summer's wish is that she really wants to learn to read, which for slaves was illegal. And Roscoe's wish is that he wants to run away and join the Union Army. So when the book begins, Summer is learning to read from Roscoe. He has been teaching her to read secretly. And the section I'm going to read, Summer is with Thea, who is the kind of conjure woman on the plantation, and they're out together beating rugs for the day. Thea called me off to the cypress tree, the same tree where Roscoe and I had had our first lesson. Summer, she was measuring her words. Learning to read is a boon and a bugaboo. It's good and it's bad. Now, Thea wasn't talking like she was mad, but something in me felt like I was being scolded. I pinched the fabric of my dress and let Thea speak. If folks ever get wind that you and Roscoe got even an inkling to read, Thea was telling me what I already knew. Then I'll be sold off, I interrupted. Thea peered at me sharply. You sassing me, Summer? I lowered my eyes. No, I said softly. It's just that even the few letters I know, the P and the Q and the U and the B, and the others I seen in the book Roscoe gave me for my birthday, well, they just make me feel so good when I look at them. Them letters are like little dancers, bending and stretching right on the page. Thea cupped her palm to my cheek. Now everybody's got a silent thunder, child, and I can see you found yours. I didn't know what Thea meant, but I sure wasn't going to interrupt her again, so I let her speak. Silent thunder is longing, Thea explained. You can't hear it or see it, but you can sure feel it, roaring up in you, calling you ahead. It's when you want something so bad that even your bones know it. I was nodding fast at Thea's words. She was describing what I felt each time I even thought about learning to read. And now I had the words for it. Silent thunder. And so I will tell you that Summer does learn to read, but you have to find out what happens to Roscoe.
When you start writing a novel, do you have a sense of where it's going to go? When you do the samurai books,
I have to know the ending.
you know the
I
ending.
write
when you
the ending
start.
first and then work backwards.
And you have an outline?
Yeah, more or less.
And when you do something like Silent Thunder,
I'm the same way. I have to know how it ends, and I often write that first, and then I write the events that lead up to that ending.
Yeah.
do you know, I still often go to the last paragraph, someplace in the middle of a book. I just
You
can't
have to know.
stand it. But you know, when a kernel of an idea comes up, the valley in that case, where did Silent Thunder come from?
Silent Thunder came quite by accident. I was at an exhibit and I saw a photo of a boy who was an anonymous boy who was a drummer during the Civil War. Then after that, I was flipping through a book in the library and I happened upon a vintage photo of a girl from the same time period who was holding a dolly, and Summer in the book does have a doll. And I thought, who are these children? How did they live? What were their lives like? And whatever happened to them? And so I made the little boy in the photo, Roscoe, and I made the girl Summer, and I invented the things that happened to them.
And the passage that you just read, which yielded the title, when you come to a passage like that, it doesn't come out in one gulp. I'm assuming that you worked very hard on finding that crucial language.
Well, it's interesting because also, in addition to knowing the ending, I often think of a title first.
Oh, really?
And yes, and think, how am I going to use this title to make a book? And that's where Silent Thunder came from, and the fact that it does mean longing. And then a little while later, the Civil War idea came, and there it is.
Oh. Now, you are in the middle of multiple careers. Here she is. She's got children at home. She's got a whole publishing line. If you go to the library or the bookstore, you'll see the books that are Jump at the Sun, Hyperion, and I'm sure Andrea is going to tell you a little bit about that. She edits that whole project. You do your own work. Where do you do your own work and when?
That's a great question. Well, yes, I wear many hats in the world of children's books. I am a children's book editor, so I help other people make their books, and I write my own books. And because I'm a mom, I'm very busy. So I do get up long before anybody else, before even the sun sometimes, and I write very
It's
early
not Jump
in
at
the
the
day.
Sun, or rather it's literally
Right,
Jump at the
exactly.
Sun.
I'm literally jumping before the sun. And so I write very early, and as I mentioned before, I do some of my best writing on the subway. I live in New York City, and even though it's very crowded, there's nothing to do on the subway. And if I'm lucky enough to get a seat, I keep a notepad with me and I write there. And I also write in hotel rooms because it's quiet and I'm feeling very centered and I'm all alone and I can get a lot of work done.
I think we should explain that you have to travel as part of your work.
That's right.
It's not gadabout vacation travel.
Oh yes, right. It's all for
You're
work.
all by yourself,
Yes.
away from your family.
That's
so there's a special concentrated silence.
And airplanes are wonderful for that also.
No one can interrupt you.
That's right.
I think long walks are best for thinking things out. I often walk around the neighborhood muttering to myself, getting some passage worked out. And the neighbors will say, "Look at that crazy woman talking to herself again." But long, long walks I find work for me.
Do you give yourself space when you've finished a difficult passage? Do you close up for the night, walk away, and say, "I'm not going to look at this story for a week or this chapter for a week"?
No, when you do something, for me, when I do something successfully that drives me on to the next part, it's when I'm stuck that I have to take these long walks and dig up dandelions in the lawn or do something.
That's interesting. I'm quite the opposite. I find that writing a novel is a very emotionally draining,
That's
sometimes,
true.
task. When I wrote Raven in a Dove House, I remember when I finished it, I just had to watch dumb movies for about a week. I sat with the remote, at night, and I just had to clear my head. So
It's exhausting.
it really is in my case.
And then when you finish a book and it's about to be published, it comes back to you for one last look before it goes to the printer. How do you feel when you look at galleys of your own work?
You find all the typos and hope you do, but you never do.
And do you want to change things? Are you content at that point to release it into the world?
No, I'm never content.
Yeah, but then I realize it's too late, and then you think about the next book. At least that's what I do.
Do you have lists? I mean, do you have projects lined up ahead of you?
Yeah, several.
I mean, you have most recently done an extraordinary book that goes back to the Chinese part of your background, and you've brought something to show people.
Oh yeah, about bound feet. Did you know that in the old days in China, grown women had to have their feet bound so tightly with bandages that they become little stumps? And these are shoes worn by a grown woman. Can you imagine how gruesome, what a revolting practice that was? And yet women did it because they think it makes them beautiful. Makes them, if you don't do it, then a good man won't marry you. And when you think about the sort of things that girls do to themselves to make themselves attractive, it scares you.
This is Lensey's novel, Ties That Bind.
Yeah.
It's a frightening practice that has only gone out of existence in this century, the second half.
When I was in China recently, I saw a woman with bound feet. She was about 60 years old. So if she had it done at the age of 5, which is about when they're done, it must have been done still in the 1940s. So can you imagine how awful, how long this practice lasted? And that was what drove me to writing that book.
So that raises the question that we mentioned at the very beginning. Did you write Ties That Bind only for Chinese American girls who are escaped this fate?
No.
Or for all of us?
For all girls, for that matter, for boys too, who do these horrible things to themselves thinking that it makes them attractive or to follow a custom. And you keep on doing it. You talk about your cultural heritage, but what if your cultural heritage includes something gruesome like this? Do you accept it? Do you maintain it, or do you try to break it? And I think we really have to choose what of our cultural heritage we want to preserve.
Andrea?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I write for everyone. Hold fast to dreams. We've all felt like the odd man out, or we've all felt different. We've all been in that situation. Silent Thunder, we've all had something we've really wanted to do that might be against the wishes of society or the day or some such.
we're going to take calls from around the country in a little while with questions, but I know that the children in this room have questions, and perhaps some of you would like to get ready to ask them. We're going to produce a microphone in just a minute. But this is the question about, well, they want us to wait a few more minutes before asking you to join us. So we'll go back to talking about the themes in your work. Go back to Raven and the question of deceit and danger and violence and how they affect ordinary children and having a motherless child.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will say that story, although that event did not really happen to me, I do think of myself as Nell, the main character. That aunt is based on my real great aunt, who I visited every summer. The cousin is based on my cousin. And, I feel that when you're a young person, there are so many things that are put to you. In this case, and this is another example of getting the title before I actually knew what the book was going to be about, the Raven is a gun. There really is a pistol called a Raven 25, which I read about in a magazine article, and that kind of stayed with me. And the Dove House is a dollhouse that Nell has that she keeps at her aunt's, and they ask her to hide the gun in the dollhouse. And I thought that was such an interesting juxtaposition, a raven, which is a gun, in a dollhouse, which is called the Dove House. And again, like I said, it was everywhere in the press at the time.
Well, but it's also about that business of spending the summer in the secure place, and life changing out from under you. If you're in middle school, in those middle years when everything is shifting and changing, everything that was so secure when you were younger suddenly isn't. And that's part of what you were working with.
Yeah, and the other thing is that even though this story is somewhat about violence, it's about families. And it's about the support that you can have around you as a young person when you're faced with a difficult decision or situation, that, there are people oftentimes you can go to, or you should try to go to. And that's what I was trying to achieve with Raven in the Dove House.
And where family fits in. And you also use that very much in the biographies, in who is supportive of creative work, of endeavors. Go back and tell a little bit about Alvin Ailey. And that's an amazing story.
Well, Alvin Ailey, in fact, when I was doing that book, his mother, I spent a lot of time talking to her, and she told me what he was like as a little boy.
Yeah, and that was in Texas.
Right.
Now, we do have a question right back here.
What is your favorite book that you wrote and why?
What is my favorite book that I wrote and why? I think I like all of my books for different reasons. Each of them kind of addresses something in me. Of picture books, I would have to say Duke Ellington, because I had the most fun working on it. And I could lay on the couch and listen to Duke Ellington music and be working.
Oh, wow. So, but let's turn that question. Which is your least favorite of your books? What would you redo if you could?
Wow. My least favorite. Well, I know that Hold Fast to Dreams was my first novel, so I was still in the process of learning how to be a novelist. So now when I look at it, there are things that I would change, of course.
Lensey?
I try not to think about my earlier work because it makes me cringe to think,
that's how I feel.
I wrote that.
What's your question?
It sounds like you always have influences for your books and characters. Do you always have to think of why that person influences your characters?
Me. I don't consciously have influence, but it turns out later that some of the characters in my book resemble certain of my relatives and friends, but I don't put a whole person in the book. I borrow an arm here and a leg there to make up a character, but I try not to use a whole person. He might get mad at me if he knew that I was using him.
How do you select the ideas for your stories, or do you not select and choose? Do you just write what you feel?
Oh, me? Oh, both?
Both, yes. Ask you both.
Okay. Well, I usually get an idea for a book when a problem comes up. Usually somebody is faced with a problem. like Yang the youngest in his terrible ear. He has a terrible ear and he has to play in a recital and he doesn't want to disgrace his family. So what is he going to do about that? So the idea usually comes from a problem that has to be solved. How about you, Andrea?
I'm usually prompted by something that I read or see on television or a dream that I might have.
Do you have clip files?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes,
Yeah.
I save things that I read or come across. Even a phrase that I kind of coin in my head, I'll jot it down and stick it in a file.
Yeah.
Do you keep a diary?
No, I don't. I did when I was a youngster.
I do. I keep a detailed diary.
There you go. We'll come back to it.
When you were younger, who was your favorite author and why did you like that book that the author wrote?
Okay.
Lensey?
Oh, well, when I was younger, I lived in China, so I read these Chinese books, and my favorite book was Shui Hu. It's about a band of Chinese outlaws, and another one is Xiu Ji. And the character is the Monkey King. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. There is an English translation, and it's about this monkey who's very, very clever and has magical powers. I love these adventure stories.
Andrea?
Well, when I was in grade school, my favorite picture book was Go Dog Go by P.D. Easton. And
You're not the only
it's
person I've heard
still
say
my
that.
favorite book. And I liked Judy Blume when I was a teenager.
We're going to come back to that in a second, but I'm sure there are many aspiring young writers in our audience. You can ask your questions now by calling 1-800-578-1396 as shown on your screen. The picture books and Judy Blume. Well, Judy Blume was an enormous influence on all sorts of people.
Of course, yes, she is,
And
because
that-
she wrote about real feelings, the things that we were really going through when I was 12 and 11.
And you said you still keep a diary.
Oh, yes, I keep a diary. In fact, I'm going to write all about this program tonight.
And do you also share your work as you complete it with your family?
I try to get my husband to read over all the books involving Japanese history so he can point out the mistakes. But I make my kids read the first draft.
You've got a question.
If you lived somewhere else, do you think you would write differently?
What
Why
a
or
good
why not?
question.
That is a great question.
Very good question.
If I lived somewhere else, would I write differently? Well, what's great about that question is there are a lot of writers' colonies in places like Vermont that are very quiet. And I don't know that I would do as much writing if I had a lot of free time and quiet. I like the hustle and bustle of New York City, and I like the noise, and it gets my creative juices flowing. So,
I think I would write pretty much the same way because a lot of my stories are historical things about olden times, and the ones about the immigrant experience are based on immigrant experiences of all Asian Americans, not particularly in one place.
Now, I'm startled. You both interpreted that question differently than I would have.
Oh.
And I heard a brilliant question where if you lived somewhere else, because I always thought about what if I were a pioneer, what if I were living in a completely different society, would you be able to write? We've got another question. Is that what you're telling me? Right down there.
Why would do you still like math, and do you want to teach it to some people still?
Gee, I haven't taught math since I started writing, so but I do like teaching. I think teaching is fun, and I like to go to schools and talk to kids. So if somebody asks me to teach math, maybe I'll do it.
Yeah.
How do you think of the names and the characteristics for your characters in your books?
For Andrea?
I keep a list of names. I keep a list of names that appeal to me. The same way I keep an idea in my head, I write down names and characteristics of people. And I just wait for the right novel to put them in.
Well, we now have a phone call from Novice, Texas. Caller?
How many books have you written in your entire life?
Lensey.
Well, I've written jillions of books, but most of them aren't very good, so nobody wants to publish them. But of the published ones, I think I'm on my 20th thing.
Oh my goodness. And Andrea,
I've written 13 books.
and how many do you have in the works?
Oh, yikes. In the works, I have 4.
4. All fiction?
1 nonfiction, 2 nonfiction, thinking as I'm
Right.
going here, and 2 other fiction.
And
2 and 2.
ideas for things to follow them as well?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Plenty to do.
Yeah.
Now, Lensey, how many have you got underway now?
I'm working on 2 at the moment and thinking about.
Do you think these are busy ladies? We now have a phone call from Bryson, Texas. Go ahead, caller. What question?
I was going to ask, what is your favorite character you ever made?
Oh, who's your favorite
Wow.
child?
Who's my favorite
Woo!
child? For me, it would be a toss-up between Nell in Raven in a Dove House and Summer in Silent Thunder.
Lensey?
Well, I guess mine would be one of the samurai heroes in my series because he's in, 7 books and going to be in an 8th one. So he's my favorite character.
Yes, won't you give us your question?
When you're not writing, what's your hobbies?
Oh, me?
Lensey.
I like to audit courses. I don't know why, but I guess I miss school. So I walk over to the nearby university and audit courses. And I like being with young people, and maybe I just like listening to teachers talk.
Andrea?
Well, I love to go to museums. Like I said, I live in New York, and when I don't want to be in New York anymore, I hit the ski slopes.
Wow.
I'm a skier.
Wow. I bet you're fast, too.
Love it. The excitement, yeah. Yeah.
We have a phone call from Mesquite, Texas. Go ahead, caller. What's your question?
Hey, when you guys started writing the books, did you ever stop in the middle?
Oh, do you ever get stuck?
Oh boy, yes.
What happens? How do you know you're stuck?
Can't write anymore. You stare at the screen blankly and nothing comes out. But since I know where I'm going, I guess you do too, Andrea, since we know the ending, we can just skip on to a later part that we do know is going to happen. And then later we come back to this part that at least I do. I come back to the part I'm stuck on, and then I seem to be unstuck.
Mm-hmm. I think most writers experience some writer's block, although I don't often, because I'm trained as a journalist and I learned first how to write for newspapers. And when you write for a newspaper, you have to write fast and quickly. And I learned that when you can't think of anything, just write anything.
How do you feel about being edited?
I love being edited.
I mean, that's what we know
I
from
love it.
journalism. Is
Yes.
that, can you explain a little bit about
Sure.
the discipline?
Yeah. An editor is someone who reads my manuscript when I'm done with it and tells me what to take out and what to put in. And I depend greatly on that person.
Yes, sir.
Like when you were little, like when did you get the idea that you wanted to start writing books?
I got the idea that I wanted to start writing books when I was 7, and I wrote a story about my mom and my dad and my cat. And I thought, I like this.
Lensey?
I was 8 when I'm a year behind you. When I wrote my first book, the title is The Princess with a Bamboo Sword, and it's, as you can imagine, it's an adventure story.
We have a phone call from Glassboro, New Jersey. Go ahead, caller.
I was curious if it was difficult for you guys to get started as a professional writer.
Lensey?
Is it difficult?
Was it difficult to get started as a professional
Oh
writer?
boy, yes. I mean, I wrote all the stuff that nobody wanted to publish, but finally I entered a contest, and having won a prize in the contest, I was able to get a literary agent, and that finally got me published.
Andrea?
Yes, being a writer is not an easy thing sometimes, and because I had written for magazines, I thought, oh, no problem, I know how to write for children, but it was so different that I had to kind of learn the craft, and in fact, books like Alvin Ailey, I sent to a lot of publishers, and it was rejected all over town, so to speak, and I didn't bring them today, but I like to sometimes bring my rejection letters so people can hear what it sounds like.
We have another studio question and then a phone caller from Texas.
Who inspired you to write?
Who were the inspirations? Were there writers you greatly admired in addition to Judy Blume? Were there people in the family who encouraged you? Your mother, you
Well,
said, was
yeah,
an
I
English
think it was
teacher.
just my mom and my dad. And, you know, because I was a kid like many kids, I did what my mom did when she was reading all the time, and that's what I did. And there was my dad telling those stories.
And you both have these extraordinarily supportive husbands.
No, my family and my husband wanted me to continue being a math teacher, but became a writer in spite of them.
We have another phone call from Mesquite, Texas. Go ahead, caller. Hello?
Hello? Jeez, man. I'm Tim Hazelwood from Mesquite, Texas, and I was wondering for Miss Andrea, how do you know about a person's childhood?
How do I know about a person's childhood? Well, I always try to speak to someone who knew that person. Like I started to say, Alvin Ailey, I spent a lot of time talking to his mom. And I go to the library and I read a lot of books and try to get as much information as I can. I try to talk to friends of theirs, people who knew the person that I'm writing about.
What kind of research do you do on your historical
Yeah,
work? For Ties That Bind, for example.
Well, some of it are stories that I knew from my family, my mother, and told us stories. For the more distant things, I like Andrea, go to the library a lot and read up, and also consult my husband's relatives and whatnot about Japanese castles and so on. There's a lot of research, but it's fun. I think that's why we do it.
Oh,
yeah.
It's one of the
But
best parts.
Yeah, you look things up because you enjoy doing it. Yeah.
And we have a question right here on the floor.
Who inspired you to write the most books and why?
Who inspired me to write the most books and why? I think it goes back to my mom and dad for me.
What about writing for your daughter?
That's a good question. Well, right, now that I'm a mom, I kind of see things a little differently. I think, what would my kids like to read? And that is a new inspiration. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
Have you tried writing something for really little kids yet?
Yes, actually, I have a series of board books that my husband Brian and I worked on a few years ago. And so those are for toddlers. And it's quite a different mindset than writing a novel, as you can imagine.
Now, does Brian come up with ideas for projects you can do together?
Oh, sure. We think of them together and obviously work on them together.
Oh, now we have a phone call from Plainfield, New Jersey. Caller?
Yes. Hi. I just wanted to know, how do you organize, both of you? You research your material, keep it organized, and feel confident enough that this is success is the ones that you've just done.
How do I organize my work?
I just look up something for that particular thing that I need to look up, so I don't.
Well, I think it's also a question about the outlines that you work from.
Oh, the
I mean,
outlines.
how do you, because you both write to a blueprint, so how does that blueprint get created? How complex is the outline you work from?
Subway rides for you and long walks for me.
Right. I mean, I do have a notebook. I wish I'd brought it with me today because you would see that it looks quite unorganized. But I do keep a notebook with me, and I always have a running outline going that's changing all the time, and I'm always consulting it.
Right. It does change a lot.
And then do characters just suddenly emerge that as you're writing that you didn't expect?
Yes.
Somebody just shows up?
They run away sometimes.
Yeah.
They have a life of their own almost. Yeah.
When you meet somebody that you weren't expecting, do you have to stop and go back to the outline, or do you just keep going and see what they're going to do to your fine plans?
I kind of just dive right in. In the case of Silent Thunder, Thea, the kind of conjure woman, just appeared one day, and I just ran with her.
Yeah.
I just let her lead me along.
Yeah.
Tell me where she wants to be in the book.
Yeah.
And you hear the voices. The question of writing dialogue is. Have any of you tried to write dialogue? It's hard. catching the way people actually talk in contemporary stories, let alone stories set long ago.
Right.
Do you read aloud? Do you read your dialogue aloud?
I do.
I do.
I certainly do.
I mutter to myself as I take these long walks and try out the dialogue.
And do you
Yeah.
try out different punctuation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Punctuation is a great tool.
Do you think about
Can't say enough
punctuation?
about it.
Yeah.
This is a question.
Would you want to write just one type of writing, like fiction or nonfiction?
No. Want to write.
Andrea?
I like to write it all. I like to try different mediums and different expressions, and I love to read writers who are trying different things. And I'm always trying to think of a new and interesting way to tell a story.
I'd like to go back to that business about punctuation, because when you're in the 5th grade or 6th grade, you think, ugh, grammar, ugh.
Right.
But it becomes extremely helpful when you're actually telling a story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. An exclamation point can do a lot of wonderful things.
Colons are great.
Yeah. Yeah.
A catch in your breath. We have a phone call from Bryson, Texas. Hello, caller.
Hello, this is Reba Starr. I would just like to know, if you were not a writer, what would you like to be?
Can you imagine not being a
Oh,
writer
I can't
now?
imagine not being a writer, but I know what I'd like to be.
What?
Well, I have a secret fantasy of being a singer and being in a music
Wow.
video.
Wow.
And I
Preferably
think
on
that,
downhill skis.
well, yes. And I think that either in my former life or in my next life, I'm going to be one of those people who can sit down at the piano and just play a song and sing.
Lindsay?
Isn't that amazing? I would like to be a musician too. I would love to play the violin, but I can't do it to save my life. So.
But those don't exclude writing. Those are things
No.
you could add on.
That's true.
Can you imagine another kind of profession? I mean, does medicine or science hold an appeal?
No, I.
No? It's writing.
Yeah.
We have a call from Huntsville, Alabama. Come on in, caller.
Do you have a hero or a fellow writer that you admire?
Do I have a fellow writer that I admire? I love Avi because he always changes himself. He's always reinventing himself. And again, finding new ways to tell a story.
Avi.
I
Who
see.
among the contemporary children's writers do you admire?
Children's writers. Gee, I don't read too many children's books because I try to grow out of them. But I like Asterix the Gaul
Oh,
because they're funny and they're full of history and
and we have a questioner right here on the floor.
Do you know if your book is going to be a hit when you're writing it?
Oh, that's a crucial question. Do you know if your book is going to be a hit?
I try not to think about that. I
Yeah.
hope that I hope that kids like it. I hope it's, a hit with kids.
Let's change that question. Have you been surprised by children's responses to some of your books?
Very much. Yeah.
Which ones surprised you?
Hold Fast to Dreams. I didn't realize so many people had the same experience. And that's great when young people come up to me and say, I've been in that situation. And I'm always writing from myself. So I'm not
Surprised to
thinking,
meet yourself?
Yeah, exactly. I'm
Surprised
not
to-
thinking, is it going to be a hit or not? It's nice when it is.
Have you been surprised by reactions to any of your books?
no, I guess they liked the ones I hoped they liked, and some of the ones that I didn't care for very much myself, they didn't like either.
We're winding down, but we've got another question right here in the room.
What is it like? What was it your dream to be a writer, or did you have other dreams?
Was it my dream to be a writer? I wanted to be a magazine editor. I wanted to work at a big, glamorous magazine, which I did do. I worked at Essence Magazine for quite a while. And I don't know if you guys know the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but Mary was my idol. She was a single woman. She lived in a big city. She had a job. She had a career. And when I was a kid, I thought, I want to be just like Mary. And that's why I moved to New York.
And now there you are working in a great big building, riding the subway,
Right, exactly.
leading the life you want.
Just like Mary.
Lensey.
Well, I guess I wanted to be a world-class women mathematician, but it just wasn't to be. And I realized my limitations. Fortunately, I realized it early enough. Yeah. So didn't have to spend years being bitter about it.
That's a very important
Yeah, and found something else that I enjoy doing
question.
almost as much, if not more. Yeah.
And taking the pleasure that you get from the work that you do isn't translatable to mathematical equations.
No, I guess not really. As I said, the only connection with my work and math must be thrift. Namely, you have to be very careful not to throw anything away.
And okay, well, we're working towards the end of this extremely pleasant program. I look forward to your new books. Would you both tell the audience about how much we've enjoyed this? Thank you for being with us. It's been a pleasure. I hope everyone enjoyed the program. I want to remind the audience that our next live performance will be Tuesday, November 30th, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Suzanne Farrell, the legendary Balanchine ballerina, will offer insights into ballet, its history, and relevance to our lives. You can get in touch with the performers or us by emailing info@pwnet.org. We also invite you to visit the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network websites at the addresses on your screen. There you'll find information and the registration form on upcoming programs and resources. Thank you.